Welcome. We have a great panel this morning and a very broad topic. Setting up international corporate governance, that is a topic unto itself, but then the twists on that, valuing the environment and regulation of corporate development in India. So we'll try to get to those second aspects, but just the whole topic of corporate governance alone might absorb us. And I guess that's really the first question is, why are we taking our time to talk about this? What is it about corporate governance that makes it a worthy topic for companies that are otherwise governed by all sorts of rules and regulations that make it very clear what they're supposed to be doing? Perhaps maybe start with Rajesh.
Good morning. You see, at times we wonder whether corporate governance is actually there or it's a farce. So when we see what is happening around the corporate India today, or with NBFCs or with banks, and so many stalwarts being named with regard to so many issues around corporate governance, it appears when such large corporate and such large banks and NBFCs, etc., are being run with such high caliber professionals, then how the issues of corporate governance at all are arising. But the fact remains that they are there. And probably each of the corporate, in spite of what the rules, regulations, a plethora of legislations, they're fighting around. If you see the matters which are pending before Supreme Court today, or before High Courts, or before NCLT, or before NCLAT, or with investigating agencies, it may be ED, or CBI, or Enforcement Directorate, the numbers are rising. And I don't think it's only India issue. It's a global issue. And in spite of whatever best regulations can come up, still these kind of problems are surfacing across globe, not India alone. So we're not alone in this journey, but certainly this is a serious problem. So the question is that the boards or the corporate governance which is happening at all possible levels, it's only a yes men kind of situation existing everywhere, or there are people who can speak up. So I also sit on a listed company board and some other experiences also as a lawyer, and I'm sure I have more experienced people on the panel here. But the fact remains that if in the promoter-driven company, or where even the companies which are not promoter-driven, where somebody is so strong and powerful that nobody stands up to say no, that is where mostly this corporate governance issue arises. So when we say corporate governance, it is not the corporate governance which is happening at the company level by simply filing ROC returns and the income tax returns and other kind of returns. Those statutory returns are filed and audited by Big Fours or Big Fives or Big Ten. But that is not alone. The question is that whether the transparency with the stakeholders, whether the transparency, when you talk about stakeholders, the whole, it's the shareholders as well as equity holders, as well as lenders to the company, the transparency is being maintained or not, accountability is there or not. And wherever these are failing, which are failing left, right, and center, the issue arises whether the rules and regulations existing today are sufficient or insufficient, or whether more can be done. I personally feel lots can be done even today, because we are experiencing difficulties at all possible levels on corporate governance. Mostly the large companies and many mid-sized companies, there are issues around corporate governance.
Maybe you can give that.
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. So good morning, and Jeff, you make a really important point, taking us back to the fundamentals. Why are we discussing this today? So I think boards sit squarely between executive staff and shareholders, and whilst it's not undesirable to have checks and balances in place, I think corporate governance needs to have a little bit more holistic approach. There are several issues that Rajesh mentioned, and I'm sure Rajiv will also talk about, regarding accountability, conflicts of interest, and other issues that we've seen and heard. But I think we need to really sit back and look at all of these regulations and laws that we have that are supposed to act as checks and balances, and where are the gaps? Are they implementation gaps? Are there gaps with respect to compliances or yes men or tick in the box compliances, versus really looking at it holistically? In India today, you have a fragmentation of multiple rules and regulations that apply that can be all classified as corporate governance. are we heading towards a era where we need to look at more consolidated compliances? What drives corporate governance? Does the SEBI drive corporate governance? Does the RBI drive corporate governance? Does the shareholder drive corporate governance? So really, one needs to sit back and really introspect as to where we are headed and whether the fragmented framework of legislation really works and whether we need to move towards consolidation of legislation. The other thing that is there in the topic is trying to look at regulating corporate development. Now, the way I understand that is, and the way Kraft Heinz understands that, and again, it's also in the news a lot, is about inorganic growth. So is India really ready? Have we really set up enough international corporate governance? Have we really valued corporate governance enough to set the tone and pace for international corporate development, inorganic growth, mergers and acquisitions in India? Thanks.
Rajiv, what would you like to add? It sounds like the first two panelists think there's a bit of a problem here. Do you think there's a problem, or in governance more generally? And we've had reference to tick the box and compliance and so forth.
It works?
Yeah.
Is it working?
Yes.
So it's not a problem. I was just wondering, when we were having a discussion about pre-discussion, and we had to wake up Jeff early in the morning at 4 o'clock because he was sleeping in his bed when we decided to have a conference call. And the thought came to me that time, are we really trying to repeat things? At least for the last 8-10 years, I've been an active participant on such circuits. And corporate governance is a very interesting topic where everyone has a view, and it keeps on coming. So I was just thinking that is corporate governance, the change we have made is internationalization of corporate governance, which puts India at a platform where we think we are going global, and we would like to have global standards so we are acceptable. So the question was that, is it the right place and to talk about it? So I tried to put some thinking and said, talking of corporate governance is going just like going for Sunday Mass. Every one of us have to talk about it, because on Sunday you have to be seen in the church and talk out good things about it, because it is good to be talked about it and good to be seen in that government. So that was my first reaction to it, and I thought it's a great idea. The second was that if that's so, can we relate corporate governance to something like God and religion, in which all of us believe, but how many of us follow is a question mark. Which is absolutely right, whether it is the large corporates, small corporates. You talk to anyone up the chain, starting from the CEO or the chairman, he says, oh, I believe in corporate governance. It's important for shareholders. It is important for shareholders' value. It is important for everything. Then the issue comes that if that is important, what do we do? So like all other laws, we have enough legislations, enough regulations, and all that we should be doing, we are made to do. And that results in the pick and bash activity, where we file all our clause 49 filings, yes. ROC, yes. The assessment done by the board, yes. And where is wrong? So the question which I have to all of us is, that if all of us believe that corporate governance is just like being religious and believing in God or Almighty, all of us feel that that gives value to the organization, not only organization, individuals. There are individuals who are known for corporate governance and they are embodiment of corporate governance because they have proved that they are above board on certain policy and principle matters. Then what goes wrong where? And why do we have to come and discuss every time and put more forms, more reporting, more filing? So the answer to that was two-pronged. One was that all of us are good people, and just now I was talking to Justice Deepak Mishra, and he mentioned there are three things which you cannot stop this world from doing. And some of them are not relevant, but one of them was greed. So greed is something which, makes you, do a lot of things, but then you have put checks and balances there. So similarly here also we have enough checks and balances in legislations, in regulations, and filings. But still things don't happen. Why? Because all the regulations and legislations are basically meant to make people drive on the right side of the road, and if they don't, they are penalized. So there are provisions for penalization. But if you don't enforce those provisions, we know how the roads in some of the places are. You know, most of the countries where have got bad road sense have got the most stringent regulations. I can tell you because they've only copied it from somebody else, some other country's regulations. So the question is that if that is so, what is the challenge? That our enforcement is wrong. We can become more, stringent, penalized. But then that is also not possible, seeing at the environment and the economics, what we have been talking about, that the people who run this country cannot be penalized, because if they start getting penalized, then who runs the country? That becomes a challenge. So having said that, what is the solution and answer? And that's where I'll stop and maybe give you a few more, leading questions. That you think the only answer available or additional answer available for good corporate governance is self-governance? Answer is yes. If you are good yourself, you don't need a law. But how will that self-governance come? So again, the self-governance has to come primarily from the change of the DNA. Because we have tested, penalization doesn't work. Or, like many people put it, because this is a conference on economics, so I will tend to use a lot of economic sense rather than the legal part. Earlier, there was God. When the world started, they said, if you do this, God will punish you. The rain will come. This drought will happen. And then you realize that, okay, God is fine, but we can negotiate him in some form or shape. We can make dams, we can store water, you can do all that. So then they said, if you that create wealth, then who's the person to whom we have to go? The next solution given was that if that is so, then we have got the king. And the king will ensure that your security is there, you get food when you want, all thing is fine. But today, it is not the God, it is not the king, because we have managed to find ways of mitigate that risk. And so today, when we are not able to understand, we don't even say that the legislature or the parliament will do it. We say, if you have to run properly, there's only one answer to it, and that is markets. So if markets are the one who will penalize you, I'm talking in the corporate sense, in the economic sense, that if market penalize people who do not have good corporate governance, that's the only way they will be put to trial. So I leave it at that, few of my thoughts on that.
That's interesting, because you've effectively made markets the new deity. But in fairness, that's not necessarily a mischaracterization. In preparation for this, I was looking at a just released institutional investor survey that's done by a group called Morrow Sodali. They do this every year. And they have surveyed 46 global institutional investors that amongst them represent 33 trillion US of assets. So this is a big group of institutional investors with a huge pot of money. And when they were asked to rank various factors in their voting decisions, they overwhelmingly ranked a company's governance policies and practices as the highest priority. Now, it's a little surprising, I thought, because the corporate strategy came in as a second, but it was a distant second. Communication in this age was number 3, but again they were distant seconds and third to an analysis by these institutional investors of the governance practices, and that's where these are the people who are the market and are putting their money places. And I know that. As was mentioned, I have some involvement with BlackRock in Canada. BlackRock, I think, is the largest institutional investor in the world, and they have a whole group that is their investment stewardship group. And the only job of this group, which numbers in the dozens, is and it's spread around the world. So it's centralized. There's centralized senior management, but it's also has offices that deal with each region in the world, and there's huge customized standards that they publish in respect of each region that attempts to customize to the regions, and they are making financial decisions on whom to invest in based on their analysis of investment stewardship, and that includes governance. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And when we talk about markets making the judgment or markets penalizing you, there have been a number of notable failures of governance that have been mentioned here. Do you think, has anything been learned? Are domestic companies seeing these failures, and is it making them do anything as a response? Rajiv, you talked about greed. When you put markets into it, the intersection of greed and good governance becomes more clear in the sense that it's in one's enlightened self-interest if you want to attract investment. How have public markets viewed these failures, and has there been any movement? I mean, I'm aware of the Kotak report. Has that received any traction? And do we think that the Kotak report is going to, in implementation, have any effect on this problem?
Certainly, you see, the regulators are aware that there are problems, and therefore these kind of regulations or reports are coming. Companies also are aware about these problems, and there are companies, the large and the small and the mid-cap, who wish to put things around corporate governance in place. But again and again, when we ask that things have been put in place, probably the answer is no or closer to no. Now, Kotak Committee report, if somebody sees, then it also again boils down to a situation that you should have more independent directors, there should be voice of independent directors on the governance, there should be participation of women directors on board, and these kind of stuff. So, just little deviating, I was part of a discussion a few days back on the issue of corporate governance again. One thing which clearly emerged in India's context was participation. So what is happening on corporate governance part, probably most of you will agree sitting here, that let's take the case of independent directors on board. For example, there's a management representation, there's independent directors who are on the board. Now, independent directors, you'll be surprised, probably I was surprised that the contribution of independent director per board is 6 or 7 working days a year. And out of those 6-7 working days a year, probably 80% times goes in informing the independent directors of what all has been done in the company, what kind of filings has been done, returns have been done, etc., etc. Is there actual contribution coming from directors is a big question mark. There was a lot of focus that his participation should increase big time. There should be more strategy discussion coming from these independent directors. There should be more no's than more yes. And then the fact itself of appointing the independent directors on board, in my opinion, is a big issue. Because you take any company, they invite independent directors, mostly the people they know, they like, or they have heard of, that they are good. Now, when these independent directors are appointed by any company, it is given that they are appointed by the people who are in control or in management. So would they like to annoy them or make them unhappy is a big question mark. So is there a defect itself in the appointment of independent directors? To me personally is a big issue. When we say that there is a forum which can be created, can we put a separate, completely a body which has independent directors, and depending on the nature, size, quantum, size of the company, the government appoints the independent directors of those caliber and skill on those boards who are totally independent then. They are not answerable to the company. Why a company should be paying a sitting fee to the director? Why can't it come from a pool created by the government and all that? I mean, it has pros and cons. It is nothing, is sacrosanct. But yes, these are open issues. So Kotak Committee report is welcome. I think 70-80% things stated therein are almost adopted and are liked. But I think there's little more to be done, keeping in view what is all happening right now.
So, Jeff, a couple of points. One is, how does the market reward or punish the lack or the lack of corporate governance or the implementation of corporate governance? Of course, subject to Chatham House rules, we know that Kraft Heinz has lost 28% share value on the back of the SEC investigation regarding our accounting practices. So, of course, we know that the market will look at such issues in corporate governance and will immediately react. Markets are dynamic, markets are volatile, and we have examples of those, and there's no denying that. I think the response to that, number one, is accountability. you need to sit up and say, yes, we made a mistake, and you shouldn't be afraid of saying that you made a mistake. And like Rajiv said, are we believing in a God because we're forced to believe in a God, or do we believe in a God because we see value in it? So that's number one. Number two, in respect of the Kotak report, again, I am not as convinced that we imbibe these things in letter and spirit, and I don't know how much of it really found its way into legislation and how much of that legislation will be implemented. I think the point you made about investor stewardship is very critical, and I think it segues into Rajesh's point regarding appointment of independent directors. I absolutely support and encourage independent financial pools to hire these independent directors, and it's a great idea to try and find a way for them to be truly independent. The problem, as Rajesh pointed out, was that how are these directors appointed? And I know for a fact that companies, executive firms that appoint or work in the area of appointing independent directors actually have come back and said that they much rather appoint somebody who they know and like than somebody who's the right guy for the job. And that is something that we need to really look at and ask ourselves. And I think Rajiv made the point earlier, you will be penalized. We're facing it, we're looking at it, and what is really the wake-up call? And I know at Kraft Heinz, this is definitely time to wake up, and it is a wake-up call.
I will take this from where you started so that I can get the benefit of my other colleagues. Any committee which is constituted is basically a reaction to a situation which has appeared in the system, which is very normal. I mean, generally don't go to a doctor if you are not unwell. So that situation comes, and then you said, okay, we'll put up a committee. So historically, if you see in India, I'm not talking of the Cadburys of the world and in what happened in US. I mean, that's Enron and company. But then that it is. But in India also, proactively based on the external things, we have made a lot of committees, whether it was the Birla committee or before that. I mean, there are n number of them. So the one which was created about a year and a half ago, which was the Kotak committee. Kotak committee was basically focused on certain issues which were being grappled by the system. The new chairman of the SEBI wanted to address that, and the committee was constituted. And I don't want to go into the details of the committee because I was actively involved, and getting work done in X number of days, getting 3 dozen people trying to help you. I don't think any thinking went into it, but the report was generated, and 70% of the issues which we already knew. They were put in a format, and then the process we have in this country is that the committee recommends to SEBI, and SEBI recommends to government, and the government says accepted, and then it's implemented. So that has been done. But has it made a material difference? I'm not sure. Whether they have given time, I remember in one of the conferences, which was while the Kotak committee was hot and we were doing, and there were many people, and I gave a suggestion which Rajesh just mentioned, and Preeti just said, that if you are talking of independence and an independent director, let's make it totally independent. And we were with very senior people, I would not like to name them, see regulators, government officials, and the nudge I got, or the reprimand I got, I was one of the youngest among those. Rajiv, you still continue to be a regulator. I've been in Reserve Bank for 15 years of my career. So I said, why do you say that? Why do you want to control even the posting of the independent directors? I said, because you are not getting quality of people, and then you are calling them independent because somebody sitting in the appointment committee of that particular group decides to appoint A, B, or C. He doesn't even know who he is, and he'll only go by word of mouth. So point I was trying to make here is that if you want to really focus on independent, make it totally independent. Have a group of people, And in India, we have such situation. There is a group of people which government maintains, people who want to be independent directors of stature. Of course, it never works, like many things don't. But there is a method of doing it. So you can also, like, you say that you have to be a graduate to get into a job, or you have to be an engineer to become whatever it is, or a chartered accountant. So you put certain requirements that you should have at least 15, 20 years of experience, you should have worked on the board, you should pass these many exams, and then you will be put there, and it will be left to the companies to decide they want Jeff or they want to have Ram Prasad Tiwari. That's their call. So I think that is something which it hurts the vested interest of many of us. If I am on the board of 10 companies, I say if that happens, maybe I'm not eligible for any of them then. So, and the last point I would like to say about Kotak Committee is Kotak Committee is a good segue into improving it in future, but I have to mention that it became very prescriptive. Committee reports are only policies. And there have been instances when we have huge number of cases where principle is decided. I mean, if all of us are lawyers, and administrative law says that the principle is decided in the parliament, the law is drafted by the government, and then there is a committee to do it, and directions are given by the concerned ministry or the rules are made. Now, if the principle is decided through rules, then those cannot be enforced because you can't change them. So I think that was one weakness I found, and it was too, long and this thing. But overall, right direction, it has changed a little. And, corporate governance or any such things, you can't expect to change overnight. It evolves. And when I said it has to be in the DNA, which means that a new person who comes on the board believes in that and doesn't believe in how to flout it, and doesn't call the company secretary and the CFO and say, manage it.
Can I ask? Okay.
Sorry,
Go
just to
ahead.
add to that, I think what Rajiv is saying and what we've seen is a lot of short-termism. This is what we see repeatedly. There's no foresight into the long-term repercussions of the decisions we make, and he made the point really like hit the nail on the head. It's this repeated message of short-termism, this pressure on sales and numbers and revenues and targets that leads us where we are today. And I don't know if we were to weigh the pros and cons between the short-term decision, that the short-term benefit versus the stock price erosion, where we ended up in the scale of balance.
That's interesting because only in the last few months there's been a lot of chatter about long-termism and short-termism, and I think there are a number of major investors, and actually I think it was sort of kicked off a year or two ago by Jamie Dimon of God, which one is he? I keep getting mixed up. J.P. Morgan. Basically saying why are we doing quarterly reporting? But more along the lines of long-termism in the sense that the investors, the institutional investors, for the most part, are things like pension funds or investment funds who have long-term horizons, and they're starting to realize that what managements and boards are doing is not in their self-interest, or is not in the interest of the investors, but rather in their self-interest. Question that occurred to me that we didn't discuss before, but with respect to independent directors or directors more generally, what is the status of personal liability of directors? Because certainly for us, in North America, the personal liability that hangs over directors is a powerful incentive for them to keep managements in line if they think, and to do their diligence and to worry about their personal liability, despite D&O insurance. Your reputation can be dragged through the mud, and you can spend years of litigation, perhaps indemnified at the end. So, what's the situation with respect to potential personal liability for the independent directors in Indian companies? And is the potential a good thing, or is it preventing people from taking those roles? Who'd like to dive in on that one? And this was something that just occurred to me as we were talking.
Actually, if you personally ask me, are people wanting to be independent directors? Yes, some of them want to. But are people who are good independent directors wanting to be personal directors? The answer is yes and no. There are lot many people I know who are very, very good people with great experience. And when you ask them, actually yesterday it happened. I was talking to an old colleague of mine from Reserve Bank. He was a deputy governor. Somebody inquired that he was looking for an independent director in a small bank. He said, no, I'm not interested in a bank. The reason being that first answer to your question is that this is personal thing, that are the independent directors allowed to behave in a manner which they are supposed to behave as per their conscience, if I can use the word. Second, do the system protect the independent directors or it is otherwise? So I think both the cases are in negative to some extent. So people try to take comfort in the corporates or the companies or the promoters on whose board you are coming to. The comfort comes from that individual whom he knows and he's ready to take an independent position rather than being a professional independent director who will do his job as per the book. So that again gets into that particular same, courtry kind of a thing, that I will go on the board of a company if I know the promoter because I want to cover my back. At least I know about his ethical standards. Rather than go to a company which may be a very big company, but I don't know what's happening there. There are at least 6 directors, independent directors I know of personally, who are on different boards of ILFS. And they said, boss, we didn't understand this is happening. And they used to consult me because I've been on the boards of my own companies and other for a long time. So they would pick up the phone. This is the resolution. What should we say? But you only see what is shown to you. All of us have sat on the boards and we are very, very good at telling what we want to tell. And in those 3 hours, and what Rajesh alluded to, effectively 6-7 days a year, working days, would culminate into not more than 40 to 50 hours of getting insight into a company and taking the responsibility for whatever they did in 365 days by 5,000 people. So then what we need to do? One, what are the filings you do with SEBI and NSE? So they will show filing done. Company secretary will say, yes, sir, we have filed. And we say, great, sir, we have seen. Then at the most, people like me get more intrusive. He says, why don't you get a certificate from the company secretary and the audit done by the company secretary and ask the internal auditor that things are fine. Then the board member, the chairman says, why the hell you want to do that? You don't trust us? No, I trust you. But I'm helping you. At least you should also know what is happening. You can't be seeing that. But then you are branded as a person who is intrusive. You say, okay, thank you very much. And you say, okay, I'm happy that So point I'm trying to make is, coming back to your point, that today the situation is such that many people of integrity and stature may not like to be on the boards of the companies. For example, if somebody tells me that, Rajiv, why don't you join this Tata board? Then the first tick is there, it's Tata's. I remember when I was working with IDFC, we had about 10, 12 companies and many people would give an arm and a leg to join IDFC because our integrity and corporate governance standards were high. I'm not saying we are the best, but they were much higher than the market. The reason could be we didn't have a promoter. There was no vested interest, at least of that extent. The reason could be that our track record for last 15 years, and I know Prasanna was my predecessor there, and things were done in an appropriate manner. I do agree that some shortcuts were made, that we can have 2 meetings, morning and evening, but they were economics. They were not trying to put things under the carpet on that. So the government or the legislations all have to do 2 things. One is give comfort to the independent auditors for some kind of coverage, which they are trying to do. And second, try to improve the quality of the independent directors and make it purely independent by taking a part of the decision making with the promoters or whoever is the helm of the affairs. And to create this pool, Actually, my suggestion in that particular round table, it was a round table with 15 of us, and everyone in his own wisdom, at least holding 5 to 10 corporate seats. I said, why don't we have a self-regulated body, like you have the IBA, you have got the, SEBI has got the body, which would be keeping the pool of independent directors in the roster, whom you have the experiences on the CV, who have got their confirmation by doing certain, for example, now, we have these conferences where, there are people like my own colleagues in CAFREL, which is a Reserve Bank promoted thing, where every director has to be trained for 7 days. It's a great training, going to Goa, 7 days. And what have you learned? I don't know. So point is, again, take over thing. If you have that pool, it will improve the corporate governance because you will have independent directors who will be actually independent, and they're not threatened that when the next cycle of their reappointment comes, they will be told what they should not be told.
Yeah, just quickly, Jeff, I think that there are a lot of rules, regulations in place. The liability of independent directors is very much there in the amended provisions of Companies Act. There's serious reputational issue as well. We have seen certain independent directors being even hauled up in the Supreme Court. I mean, to what extent they were liable, nobody knows. Even in one of the matters, Supreme Court went ahead and attached the assets of independent directors. So all those things have happened. On the criminal side, we have lookout notices for a number of good independent directors who probably should not have been identified for that purpose, but it happened. So I think rules, regulations, all those things are there on paper. Question is again same thing, letter and spirit, whether they was being followed, not followed. And there's a lot of deterrence for independent directors, as already mentioned. People don't wish to come on the board. You just make a small study of how many independent directors have resigned from the board in last 18 months, you will get the answer.
So Jeff, I certainly echo what Rajesh and Rajiv have said. There is provisions in the Companies Act for personal liabilities of non-executive directors, and they are in certain instances and circumstances. And like Rajesh said, that there is a lot of lookout notices, and they need to appear in courts, and yes, it does form a deterrent. What I am thinking about is that when you have, I think what's happened is that again we've tried to make personal liability very selective. So we haven't really looked at it more holistically, and we're really missing the woods for the trees for the woods. I mean, we're just not looking at it holistic.
Yeah, it strikes me as we speak that when you say holistically, I'm thinking back to the many discussions of corporate culture and the fact that you can have as many lovely drafted rules, as many great structures as you want, but if you get into it and you discover that the culture is toxic, there's no amount of ticking of the boxes that's going to help you. Just as a matter of interest, from a Canadian perspective, we have a thing called the Institute of Corporate Directors, and there are two. They issue a certification after a quite rigorous university level program, as does the Chartered Director course. They're both run in conjunction with universities as executive education, and that provides a pretty good pool. And again, this is not something that we discussed before, but it sort of comes up in the topic about setting up international corporate governance, and it's sort of the idea of what do Indian companies need to do if they have global ambitions. If you have global ambitions, either in the corporate development sense of becoming either a merger target to exit at a good price, or as an acquirer of foreign companies who will be under a microscope when you make your offer. What would be the major steps that you would take if you were in such a company that was trying to take yourself from what you'd view as a typical Indian company structure and procedures and turn it into something that's going to be ready for prime time, as they say?
So I'm taking the liberty to speak first here because this is an example of what I've just done. Kraft Heinz owned Heinz India Private Limited that housed the brands Complan, Glucon-D, Nycil, and Sampriti Ghee. Complan and Nycil and Glucon-D are some of the most trusted brands in India. They were owned by the Kraft Heinz Group, and they were sold to Zydus Wellness, an Indian multinational that is part of the Zydus Cadila Group. That is actually the Indian company that has pharmaceutical interests in the US. So I guess maybe I'm poised to answer both parts of that question. So number one, in terms of being ready for an acquisition, I think what you alluded to earlier and what we discussed briefly was about our codes of conduct and about financial diligences, in whistleblower policies, investigations, making sure that everything that you need to do doesn't come up as a surprise to you in a vendor diligence or in a buyer diligence at the time of corporate development or acquisition. The other thing is that when we look at an Indian company setting up shop in another jurisdiction. Let me give you an example of a company that I worked with that was sued in the US for selling Egyptian cotton bed sheets that were not necessarily procured from Egypt. So you face a US class action lawsuit for misbranding and mislabeling. And you have to understand that when you're an large Indian company with exports in other jurisdictions, you cannot have a laissez-faire or a casual attitude about corporate governance. And it is a gap in corporate governance that resulted in these checks and balances, or this, as I'm colloquially, chalta hai attitude, which means it works. It's okay. We'll brush it under the carpet. So my point of view is that if you want to be seen as a prime time target, or if you have global ambitions, you need to not only look to your peers. And I mean, earlier in the year, last year, I was speaking at a panel in the US, and I found that my peers knew more about Indian laws than I knew about theirs, and that is really where we need to really understand our place in the global economic landscape, and really see the value that we bring as an emerging market and next gen. Yeah.
Priti very aptly mentioned some kind of I would use the word weakness, but areas where we need to strengthen ourselves. And personally, you asked that question, and my friends accuse me of being a utopian. And the reason for that is that I always look at a bigger picture and in the sky, because I firmly believe that if you look towards the moon, you will achieve something on the ground. So talking about the corporate governance piece and talking about the independent directors and the globalization, my wishful thinking would be, and not for myself, maybe it's for the next generation now because of my gray hair, if India could export independent directors globally, like we are doing IT and other things, that would be, and that requires at least 3 or 4 preconditions, to put it in the lawyer's line. The first and the foremost is awareness and knowledge of the laws within the country and globally, which, as Priti just mentioned, that many people overseas know about our laws better than what we do, for whatever reason. The second is, which is very, very important, is the DNA or the value system. See, ultimately in corporate governance, you can make an act out of it, but the basic premises is the value system. And you don't need to read the law. You know what is right, what is wrong. It's the, what I sometimes, when I speak at some of the younger people, what I call, that's the mother test. Will your mother like if you did this or not this? That's the answer to you. Every human being can get that answer. And then he can relate to the law which is not permitting him to do so. So if you are able to have the knowledge globally, if you are able to have the value system, and you test in this country, and you have a situation where some country in the Middle East or somewhere says, we would like to have an independent director from India with this experience, that's it. And that can only happen when we have the resources like this, who have been trained accordingly, and we have a system which respects them. Otherwise, we will have independent directors and independent directors, we'll have companies, and we'll still have Satyams of the world and ILFs of the world.
I agree completely, and I believe that transparency, accountability, and also respect for international laws. So when you're targeting going outside, and these things are critical. I know now we are running against time, but a very two-line story which I heard long time back on this, that there was a river which changed its course. The river changed its course, the fishes followed the water. And the fishermen who were fishing in village A, they went to village B to fish. And the fishermen at village B said, you can't fish here because you could only fish at village A. The matter went to the court, and the judgment was that the river follows the course of nature, the fishes follow the water, and fishermen follows the fish. So when you're talking about international law, probably all of us are fishermen. I have a small office in Singapore. I want to go there and do practice or make money in Singapore and earn name there. Similarly, so many firms are operating here on corporate world. So I think the respect for international laws when we are in the international boundaries is something very, very critical. So when we are outside India, we should respect their laws and vice versa.
I find it interesting, just the I guess globalization is the world, but I prefer internationalization of governance because the investors and the markets are becoming absolutely integrated, and that brings us to the question, effectively, of extraterritoriality. And I think anyone who lives in any country other than the United States or the EU, I guess, are constantly learning and spending time engaging in compliance with respect to laws that were never passed by your legislators. How does that play out in India? I'm thinking, Preeti, as as a subsidiary of an American listed company, you're going to end up subjected to the SOX compliance, and how do you translate some of these international rules that were written by American or European legislators for their domestic markets, but which have global effect by virtue of the strength, the reach of their markets? How do you deal with that in a developing country?
Not without considerable stress and anxiety and sleepless nights and quizzical consequences. So I'll give you an example. So when we do Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX testing, we need, and it's financial testing, even though it's a corporate governance legislation in the US, we need to ensure that the whistleblower hotline that is based in the US works. And so sometimes we wonder, how would we test that this works? Do we make anonymous phone calls and say, are you working? So yes, it does end up into a little bit of a tick in the box. Or for example, I have an uneducated vendor who provides me stationery who needs to sign an FCPA declaration, and he doesn't even own a computer. So some of those things become really quizzical, and interpretations become really difficult in that sense. But I think as a multinational, as an Indian subsidiary or as an erstwhile Indian subsidiary of a multinational, it is very important for us to, like you said and like Rajesh said and Rajiv said, it has to be part of your DNA. It has to be in your culture. It has to be tone at the top. And you have to be that sort of intermediary that decodes that and explains to people the rationale behind it and push back when something is not possible or cannot be done, and explain to the powers that be, that if there is a guy who has no interaction with the government and he doesn't even own a computer, he doesn't need to sign an FCPA declaration just because he's going to become your vendor.
Right. Okay, I don't know how much leeway will be given, but you know what? I should open the floor for at least a couple of minutes to the audience to get a couple of comments or questions from the audience. We've got too much to talk about. I mean, the topic is huge. We never really got to the environment, and we got a bit of corporate development, but we really didn't get even through our corporate governance thoughts. So, audience, it's your turn. Questions, comments? Oh, there's one. 5 minutes? Okay, we have 5 minutes, so.
Yeah. Hi, just one question regarding, how do you balance out financial performance vis-a-vis compliances? In every board meeting, the initial discussions always happens on numbers. One of the reasons why non-compliances happens is, again, there are tremendous business pressures for expansion, for, profitability, for getting into new territories. So unless the corporates or businesses, recognize the need for having a balance between the two, it will never make any business sense. So how do you see that in your respective organizations?
So I'll start, I made a point about long-term versus short-term views earlier, and if you take a short-term view regarding financial targets and you don't take a long-term view, you end up being investigated by the SEC, and you really need to understand the consequences and the ramifications of your decisions, and you have to learn to take responsibility and be accountable. So the number one thing that needs to be put in perspective, and it's the job of people like me who sit on the board and who are in management and who are the ethics and compliance officers of the company and who are the general counsels of the company, to be that voice of reason and to question some of the decisions or the reasons or the non-compliances.
Actually, I can give you a little more insight into it. Being a general counsel and of a bank, which is the most regulated, and compliance is compliance is the most important thing there. I don't think any management will try to shortchange discussions on compliance. I do appreciate that business numbers are important, but it is again the culture. We spend more, okay, you don't do it in the board, you put it in the audit committee, where you can only talk about compliances and all those things. And there had to be a sitting agenda on compliances and regulations. So I don't believe that becomes the individual DNA. I'm not talking of the corporate DNA. The person who's representing on the board compliances and audit, it is his DNA which has to ensure that is taken up and discussed. He may face a lot of flack. There are many people who will, say, this guy is only for telling us what not to do. But the fact is that if that is what you are and you don't do what you are supposed to do, then the whole company will be started. So at least in the financial sector, especially in banking and NBFC, the question asked is, if this is a license impacting activity, will you do or not? And no one will say, yes, we'll do it.
And I guess we should be wrapping up, but I'll make one last comment that actually seconds what Rajiv was saying. I think that, and it relates to what Rajesh was talking about in terms of the time that independent directors spend. I think there's, you can get a lot more done by just management of the time of the board and the use of committees of the board, and the way that you feed things up into the committees, the standing agendas of each of those, the reports that they give, so that when you have the directors in a room for a limited period of time, you're confident that everything that they're hearing has been strained through to the point where the thing that they're there for, which is presumably their independent judgment and their perspective, that you're using that and that you're not using them the way that you'd be using maybe a management committee that feeds into an audit committee of the board that then feeds a report into the board, distilling issues each time. So I think there are ways that you can do it with time management. That sounds sort of simple, but
because we have general counsels here, I have one piece of advice also, my experience. What we talk about the DNA, what we talk about the environment, what we talk about the lack of respect for things, that starts from us. We talk about the company, we talk about the environment. What about us? If our DNA is right, if our conflict issues are right, if our focus is right, then the probability of others aligning is much higher than if you yourself are a question mark.
exactly. On that note, sort of inspiring note, I'd like to thank our panelists and thank you, the audience, thank you for your patience and attention.